everyone. Happy Friday, and welcome to our first Friday where we have Instructor Insights. My name's Chris, and I am an instructor and director of international training with Ricklander Zalowski. And I'm here to spend a couple minutes with you guys on a Friday morning. It's good to see people checking in and saying hello. And today's conversation, what I want to do is actually kind of touch a little bit on biases and have a little conversation about, sometimes that elephant in the room that we never want to talk about, or sometimes we just don't want to acknowledge is actually within us, but talk about the biases that we actually carry and bring into the interview room and some of the challenges that those biases might actually create for us during the interview process, whether we are interviewing victim, witness, suspect, regardless of the circumstance in which we're interviewing the individual or information we might be seeking from them. Biases play a big role in how we might be questioning, observing behavior, evaluating responses, and it could have an impact on again, maybe the outcome as we see it. Because one of the things I think is important to understand as it relates to bias is we see the world not how we see it, but how our brain sees it. So a common awareness of the types of bias that you might bring into the conversation could be a very healthy way to approach an investigative interview. So we're going to talk about some of those things. Speaking of biases, how many of you are a little biased about the result of the football game last night, Chiefs-Ravens? I will tell you, as a Steelers fan, I love the result, but it's based on a bias because anytime I can get a loss from one of the teams in my division, I'm a happy man. When I look at it, it might have actually been a touchdown, though. The idea is biases surround us because, like I said, it's not how we see the world, it's how our brain sees the world. And so I think there's some important things to consider when we go into an interview room. So let me kind of break down a couple different things for you guys and give you something to think about on this first Friday of the month here. First, kind of just thinking about what is bias. Let's ask ourselves a question here. And if you kind of look in the mirror and think to yourself, do I have bias? I think to a certain degree, many of us want to think, well, no, I don't, or I try not to, or I set my biases outside the door anytime I'm having an interview or a conversation, et cetera. But I want you guys to think about what is bias here for a second. I wrote a couple things down here. So when you think about what is bias, right? So bias is that tendency, the inclination or prejudice towards or against something or someone. Okay, reasonable, right? Sometimes biases are good. Biases tell me not to eat that spicy burrito because I know I'm going to get a little, right? Sometimes biases influence the interview room in a negative way and interview the things that we do. So what we have to do is really think through how these biases might be impacting us and understanding that they are generated from the mindset of an in-group and an out-group. And to me, one of the things I talk about sometimes when, teaching a class and going through instruction is sometimes the bias that we bring in when we kind of look at things from this in-group and out-group sort of thing. It's easy to have a bias in that moment because our first thought, particularly if we're talking about someone who we believe is a suspect of a crime, our first thought is, I would never do that. Therefore, they're automatically a part of my out-group. And so now I have a bias toward the individual just simply from the way we kind of designate each other in this role. I'm a person of authority in this corporate environment. You aren't, therefore you're different than me. And we bring that into the conversation. And so what we need to understand as a part of this is, how does it impact the interview? Well, how can it impact us? The interview biases can lead to premature conclusions, right? We overlook important evidence, right? Maybe condemning someone based upon things that are not accurate. Again, it's not how we see the world, it's how my brain is seeing the world here. So understanding the impact of bias is the first step in kind of recognizing how it could have a negative impact on what it is we're doing here. Interesting. For those of you that maybe subscribe or have listened to Dave Thompson's podcast, Truth Be Told, he had a really good, interesting conversation. I'm probably going to say the doctor's name wrong, but Dr. What is it? Kukuka, I believe it is, Jeff Kukuka. Really interesting conversation about the brain, about human biases, and some of the different research that goes into it. I encourage you guys to go, take a listen to that. Again, it's Truth Be Told podcast. Dave talking to Dr. Jeff Kukuka, making sure I got that right. And they talk about various cognitive biases and some of the research into cognitive biases. And I found it interesting to think about, as one of the examples that came up was a TSA agent. And all day long, nothing of any concern passing through, nothing. Suddenly something passes through, but my bias is because I see all day long nothing coming through, then I'm not actually anticipating something will come through. Think about how that impacts the interview room from a perspective of, most of the people that I'm talking to are suspects. When I'm talking to them, the only reason I'm talking to them is because they're suspects. So they must be guilty of something. They're guilty. Therefore, I go in with the mindset, this preconceived notion that they're guilty because they fit that path, that I've, and that I'm used to dealing with, sort of thing. These are the biases that lead us in the interview room. But when you think about the various biases, what I wanted to touch on today with you guys is a list of 7 different biases that could be common bias influences within the conversations, that we have. And breaking down the 7 different biases that could be influential biases to us in the interview room. The very first one that I think it's very easy for an investigator to fall victim to is the confirmation bias. Now, when we look at a confirmation bias, the easy view of it in simple perspective of what is it is we want to confirm our own theories, right? As a part of an investigation, we may take on the early mindset and critical thought process of creating a hypothesis of what we believe happened based upon having limited information, limited evidence, limited background on my subject, etc. So we sort of fill in the blanks. Our brain does that for us. And through this, we create our own hypothesis. If we think about our confirmation bias, what happens and why it's easy to fall victim to this type of bias is oftentimes we want to prove our own theories as being accurate. See, I told you. I knew that's what happened. That may influence how we actually question our interviewee. Are we asking questions? Have we prepared a list of questions that are designed to confirm my bias, or are they blindly open and objective to obtain information? And we have to think about something that goes as far back as preparing for an interview, let alone, executing that conversation. But that confirmation bias, really think through, what are my thoughts? Are my thoughts leading me to asking appropriate questions? Are my thoughts leading me to just simply confirm what I thought happened? Or am I looking for alternative solutions? We'll talk about some of the ways we want to adjust and fix these things. Another bias is an outcome bias. The outcome bias is when we are focused on the outcome, regardless of process. So we want to change our mindset to be more focused on the process. I will say, and I've said this for a while, is if you are in some position of authority, where you have investigators working for you, conducting investigative interviews. And if the first question you ask when they complete that investigative interview is, did you get a confession? Then I'm going to say, shame on you. Because all we're focusing on is the outcome and not the process that got us there. Well, I got the result that I wanted. That's all I care about. Is my result then, once again, based on a confirmation bias or other forms of bias that may, shine through during the interview room. But I want you guys to think about the outcome bias. Process is important. I can remember having a conversation with Dave Zalowski many years ago. Completed an investigation, what I felt was a quite good result. Conversations recorded, did my self-evaluation, made it available for peer review, Dave Zalowski is typically one of the first ones to grab that for peer review. He called me into his office. I thought he was going to call me in and give me a nice little pat on the back. Good job. But he called me in and said, why did you skip this part of the conversation? Felt like I didn't need a bus. We don't skip. We follow the process. Okay. We want to avoid this outcome bias. The next one is prejudice. And prejudice, I think, kind of speaks for itself, right? I think we know what prejudice is. But when we think about, what prejudice is and what it brings into the conversation, it becomes this negative attitude towards the person we're interviewing, person we're communicating with. And if I bring this negative attitude based upon prejudices, which might be, kind of an implicit bias, which we'll get to as well, that once again may have a negative outcome on how I'm interpreting or evaluating their behavior. Once again, if I see someone as my out group, they're the opposite of me. I would never act that way. That is completely inappropriate. That shouldn't happen. They're my out group. I come in with this bit of prejudice, this negative attitude towards the individual, then perhaps when it comes to a behavior analysis, when it comes to me trying to evaluate responses, I'm only focusing on the negative. It's interesting going back to the conversation that Dave had with Dr. Kakula, right? I got that one always messes me up. Right? In fact, Dave's talked about his students always forget his name, right? But if you think about, if we are guided in a way and provided prejudice, think about people handing you data that becomes a part of your investigation and how that might influence having a negative attitude towards the individual and create that prejudice that we might be unaware of, impacting, once again, how we proceed within the interview. We also have a cognitive bias. The cognitive bias is probably the most common type of bias. And within the cognitive bias, it is the thought process of I identified this individual as being guilty, and this is where misclassification errors and other things like this take place. We obtain information from someone that may not be relevant. And if you think about, again, whoever's collecting data for us, what's happening within the investigation, I use that piece of information to influence how I pursue the truth, how I'm pursuing information during the conversation. So thinking about the cognitive bias, process things properly, set them in proper context, so that they actually have a relevant role within the way we approach a conversation, which leads us to the next type of bias, which is contextual bias. When we talk about, contextual bias, it's taking analysis in a way that maybe we're again spinning it, which kind of ties in some of the other biases we're already talking about. I'm getting this data. I want to spin it to confirm my theory. This is exactly what I was looking for. Wait, this information is exactly what I need right now. So what we need to do is take, again, that cognitive, put it in proper context, so that it's relevant to the information that we're gathering. Sometimes the contextual bias is something as simple as, well, this guy has a criminal past, so he has a pattern, or he has a history of, right? Contextual bias even puts things in when that waiter or waitress comes to you and says, oh my God, you're going to love this dish. This is my favorite dish. As you eat it, you're influenced by that data. Wow, this was fantastic. I loved it. But maybe it wasn't that good after all, right? The next thing we look at is an implicit bias. The implicit bias, it occurs automatically, unintentionally. Oftentimes it's the makeup of who we are. And based upon upbringing, based upon influences early in our life, there's things that happen within us that we have this implicit bias. I walk down the street, I see that Ravens logo, and my heart starts to go. Some of you seeing this simple little logo this morning, go Irish, perhaps your implicit bias, set you off a little bit there. But the idea here is this implicit bias. It's something that has shaped us and now may play an influence on how we're interpreting, evaluating, observing, all the other things that take place. And then the last thing I want you guys to consider here, the last bias we'll take a quick glimpse into here, is statistical bias. When we talk about a statistical bias, it's evaluating data, data that we want to fit into our narrative, data that may not be completely relevant, data that we have to put in proper context. All of these feed one another. So the key to really understanding bias and being able to fix our biases and how they influence the conversation is awareness. It all starts with awareness. Whether we take a self-evaluation, we look in that mirror and we think, what is it that I bring into the conversation that could be positive, that could be negative, and kind of doing the best we can to be objective. The idea here is to sit and say to someone, hey, don't be biased. Hey, leave your biases outside the room. It's not realistic. And it's not something that could be as impactful as we need and as impactful as we want. So what we need to do is we actually need to start by admitting the fact that we do have bias, and that self-awareness and which biases we have and how our biases might guide or influence us during the interview, right? And to get over that, some of the things we want to do is have certain protocols in place, create standards, remove some of the human element, get objective views and opposing views, seek alternative theories, get critical feedback, rather than we're all in the same in group, so we're all going to see this in a very similar light. Let's get different perspectives on what might be taking place within the investigation, or as we evaluate the information obtained during the interview process. But ultimately, through all of this, what we have to do is just, once again, be mindful. As a professional investigator, we all need to perform things in a certain way to ensure that our pursuit of the truth, our pursuit of accurate information, is as uninfluenced as possible here. And writing a quick note down here: self-evaluate, accept feedback, provide feedback to others, strive for objectivity while information seeking in the interview room. Without any awareness, it's nearly impossible to grow and become effective in your pursuit of the truth. So guys, create a little bit of awareness around your bias. Understand that they do exist. They exist within yourself. They exist within your teams and the others that you work with. And let's do the best we can to obtain information as accurately as possible and not allow those biases to influence us. So I hope you guys have a wonderful Friday, weekend, rest of your month. We will see you back here on the first Friday of next month with some more information and another instructor insight. I appreciate your time. And thanks for those of you that popped in and are hanging out with me live. I appreciate that. But it was, I hope you guys got some good takeaways and some things that you can really think about and explore a little bit further. So thanks again for your time, guys. Happy Friday. Have a great weekend. Go Irish. Talk to you later, guys.